Hey there, and welcome to class. I hope you've had a great week and that your classes are getting settled. I wanted to take a little moment today to think about what feminism is, to kind of go into an introduction of what we'll be looking at. As I mentioned before in the syllabus and elsewhere, I think there's a lot of images of feminism out there. I heard the popular radio show host Rush Limbaugh call feminists feminazis, and that word seems to be bandied about in the media. And obviously that's a slur against feminists. There's this notion that all feminists are man-haters or lesbians. And which of these things are true? Are any of them true? What's feminism really all about? And that's what we're going to be exploring together. I mentioned before as well that these readings that we're going to be doing, I hope you're making an effort to get a hold of the book, by the way. I've gotten some emails from a couple of you about that. And these readings are really interesting. And when we go through them, we're going to be going through a historical journey. I think another idea that people have is that feminism is something that came about in the 60s or 70s, and that's really not true. So we'll take a look at where did feminism come from? What are its historical roots? And things like that. So, again, I think people have a cartoon version of what feminism is. I think they have an idea about what it's all about, and that if you're a feminist that maybe you hate men or something like that. And really it's a lot more subtle and sophisticated than that. And it's also very divergent. There are many different strands of feminism. So some will resonate with you, others may not, and that's okay. So I hope and encourage you to think about this as a journey, an intellectual journey and a personal journey that we're going on together to explore these ideas, to think about what fits for you, what resonates with you in your life. There was a wonderful saying that came out of the 60s feminists, and they said, "The personal is political." And that's the idea that what we choose to do, how we live our lives, is a statement of our beliefs. So what I'm hoping that this course will allow you to do is question the way that you live, the things that you do, how you choose to present yourself, and that the ways that you choose to live are your choices. A lot of times we go on autopilot. Maybe we do what our parents did or what all the people in our neighborhood do. But the wonderful thing about college is you get exposed to new ideas, new ways of thinking, and that allows you to sort of question and think about more consciously the choices that you're making in your everyday life. So I just want to encourage you to do that, to think about your life as we go and how you're living and how these readings and discussions fit with how you're choosing to live. And I'm really glad you're here. So let's get started and think a little bit more about feminism. This is a great quote too. Feminism is the radical notion that women are people. I really like that idea. So let's get into a little deeper dive into defining feminism. So first thing that we want to know is this, that feminism is not a recent phenomenon. In other words, it didn't come about out of the 1960s or 1970s, as many people think. It can actually be traced back to roots in European culture at least 200 years ago and possibly earlier. A couple of key texts, and we'll hopefully read some of these here through our class, is Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women, and that was written in 1792. That's a long time ago. Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own was written in 1929. This is one of my favorite essays, and I encourage you to read that, and we'll be exposed to that during our time together in this course. And thirdly, Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex was written in 1949. Now, as you can see, none of these are very, very recent, but feminism as a way has been unfolding over many, many years, and also has unfolded in different ways depending on its historical context. So the term feminism was first used in 1851, and there are multiple definitions of feminism that exist since that point in time. Number one, this is from the Collins English Dictionary. Feminism, a doctrine or movement that advocates equal rights for women. I'll say that once again. This is the Collins English Dictionary. Feminism is a doctrine or movement that advocates equal rights for women. The second is from Elaine Showalter, from A Literature of Their Own, British women novelists from Bronte to Lessing. This is from 1978. Elaine Showalter says feminism is a phase of protest against the standards and values of the dominant tradition and advocacy of minority rights and values. Now again, note the time, 1978. What was going on? So that meant she was writing this post probably 1970, right around the time of gay rights, civil rights, things like that were rising up, the 1960s, post-60s era. Let me read that to you again. This is Elaine Showalter's definition from A Literature of Their Own, dated 1978. A phase of protest against the standards and values of the dominant tradition and advocacy of minority rights and values. Our third definition comes from Catherine Belsey and Jane Moore from the Feminist Reader. This was dated 1989. Their definition is thus: the Feminist Reader is enlisted in the process of changing the gender relations which prevail in our society, and she regards the practice of reading as one of the sites in the struggle for change. I'll read that one more time. This is The Feminist Reader from Catherine Belsey and Jane Moore, dated 1989. The Feminist Reader is enlisted in the process of changing the gender relations which prevail in our society, and she regards the practice of reading as one of the sites in the struggle for change. Michel Foucault said something interesting in his theorizing. He said, knowledge is power. And this is what this definition is suggesting, that reading could be a subversive act, could be an act of changing gender relations. Step one of change is awareness, reading, which is what you'll be doing and what you are doing during the course of our time together, can really be step one in terms of the steps toward making change. So let's think about, what do these definitions all have in common? Number one, that women do not possess equal rights to men, either legally, socially, or otherwise, and that gendered, in other words, male-created and male-centered dominant traditions that enforce this inequality must be challenged and changed. The growth of feminist literary and cultural criticism in contemporary period has been a product of academic development, but the origins of feminism really lie in a much longer struggle for political and social change. So let's take a little deeper dive now into the history of feminism. its battles and its achievements, which can shed light on a variety of realms in which gender inequalities manifest themselves, as well as speaking about the means through which change can be effected. So until later decades of the 19th century, women became literally selfless upon marriage. Here is William Blackstone from Commentaries on the Laws of England. This comes from 1765. And Mr. Blackstone says, "By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in the law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband, under whose wing, protection, and cover she performs everything." When women married, women's property became their husbands, as did the woman herself. Note the similarity here of wives' existence to that of a slave. In other words, a property of the owner, performing unpaid labor and unable to own property themselves. John Stuart Mill talked about that in The Subjugation of Women in 1869. In 1878, the Matrimonial Causes Act came into being, and that said that wives can separate from abusive husbands. The Married Women's Property Act came about in 1893, where wives gain full rights of ownership of property acquired by them before and during marriage. So the Married Women's Property Act gave women the right to own property. 1893. The next big social movement, which you're probably more aware of, is called women's suffrages. Now, this was around 1866 to 1928, and we'll dive deeper into that later, but I think it's interesting to note my family were Quakers. They came to this country in the 1600s, before, about 100 years before, a little more than that, before this country was formed. They were in the Philadelphia area with William Penn and all those Quakers over there. And they were escaping religious persecution from England because the Church of England was in power, and like the Catholic Church, there was this notion that you had to go through the priests and the bishops and all that to really have a relationship with God. And the Quakers believed that in order to have that relationship with God, you had to be able to read the Bible yourself. So the Quakers put a big emphasis on education for everyone for that reason. And they really believed that all men were created equal under God, and hence women as well. So my point being here is that many, and I didn't know this until recently, many of the early suffragettes that are there fighting for the women's vote were Quakers. In 1918, so the campaign began to get the women's vote in 1866, and it wasn't until 1918 that the vote was granted to women. However, it wasn't granted to all women. You may not know that either. It was only granted to women over the age of 30. In 1928, 10 years later, the vote was granted to all women over 21. The next big law, you could say, act that came into being that pertained to women came about in 1975. It's quite a few years later. And this was post 1960s, which we can look at that era in more detail later, it was a time of great social upheaval, questioning the dominant values in society by mainly the baby boomers, who were the largest generation in history at the time, and they were in college and whatnot. And the Sex Discrimination Act came out of that in 1975. That act prevented employers from paying men and women different salaries for doing the same job. However, even though that Sex Discrimination Act was passed in 1975, the pay gap remains a central issue to feminists to this day. And, women are still earning about a quarter less or even more than that than men in some cases. And we'll look at that in more detail later on down the line. In 2004, the Civil Partnership Act gave same-sex couples the right to marry and to have the same inheritance and other financial rights as heterosexual married couples. Here's one thing to take note of. Legislative change on its own is not the solution. It has to be met by a shift in social attitudes, such as those reflected in popular culture and in things that people are reading and seeing out in social media, for example, these days. So, feminism, as such, seeks to raise social awareness of women's abilities, women's rights, women's creativity, and women's sexuality. So, let's now dive into feminism more particularly and think about the history. The women's movement, or feminism, is frequently spoken about in terms of waves. The first wave of feminism was in about 1900 to 1928, and this was concerned with legislative and social reform, including women's suffrage, which we just talked about, getting women the right to vote, and women's access to education. There have been many colleges in history which didn't allow women to enroll at all. The next wave is called second wave feminism. This is the one that came out of the 1960s to 1980s, and that's the one that most of us are familiar with through the media. And this is characterized by politics of sisterhood and collectivity, women's rights over sexual and reproductive bodies and health, for example, access to contraception and abortion. The second wave feminism included ideas around equal opportunities, and women's studies degree courses came out of this time, things like that, and the inclusion of more women writers in university syllabi. You know, if you think about the word history, his story, makes a lot of sense when you think about it that way, doesn't it? That it's always been tilted toward male achievements and male writers, etc. So women want to be included, and women have done a lot of amazing things, including in technology and early computer development, computer code writing. I mean, a lot of amazing things that men have sort of taken the credit for oft times. So this is the idea that women want to get more inclusion of women at this point in time into university readings. The so-called third wave of feminism came about after 1990 up until about now, and this emphasizes women as individuals rather than a unified group. This third wave of feminism, I believe, is informed by postmodernism and post-structuralism, and this idea that they talk about there's no grand narratives anymore, that everything is splintered and fragmented and local and specific. So this is the idea now that instead of women as one giant group, I mean, think about it. Think about if you're a woman, think about, do you have something in common with every other woman, and socially, let's say, And for you fellas, same thing. Think about the women you know. Are they all the same? Or women you see on television or social media or in the media? Are they all women the same? Do they all have the same issues? Do they all face the same struggles? So third wave feminism addresses that, because of course they don't. And it complexifies feminist theory in terms of not only gender and looking at different categories of oppression and things that happen in terms of inequality based on gender, but also includes things like social class, socioeconomic status, sexuality, whether you're gay, straight, bi, and on, ethnicity, race, religion, etc. So this idea that people can be in different social positions, which we'll be looking at together during the course of our time, and that maybe their oppression or their inequalities will be experienced differently based on that social position. And there has been a critique in third wave feminism of a lot of Western consumer and beauty culture, which tends to objectify and exploit women. And there's also a focus on violence against women and things like anti-rape campaigns and victim blaming on campuses, for example, or for the lack of women in high-powered jobs, for example. I know that there was a recent study came out, we'll look at this later, but that there's very few women involved in tech jobs in Silicon Valley, and that there's very few women in the C-suites, the top suites of executives in the business world. So that kind of thing. So we'll take a look at that. So, although popular to describe feminism in terms of waves, and that's how we'll typically think of it, I think it's easier to sort of categorize it that way. It's problematic in the sense that thinking of it as a wave, like a wave that goes by, kind of implies that if the first wave rises up and then goes away, that it's over. That the concerns, for example, of first wave feminism are over. And then the second wave rises up and then it's over. And now we're on to the third wave. And that's really not the case. It's just that feminism is evolving. It's responding to historical context and the things that are going on in popular culture, in society. And so for that reason, it evolves like other things do in society. So take note of that idea. So let's take a look at this idea of women and sexual politics. There has been a demand for change which is underpinned by the acknowledgement that women's inequality is not natural, but instead that it's socially constructed, meaning that it serves patriarchal, in other words, male-dominated and male-centered societies and cultures. So this idea that women's inequality serves a purpose which upholds, let's say, the dominant pattern of social relations in male-dominated and male-centered societies. Secondly, this idea that identity is not something singular and stable, but something that has multiple aspects. Think about your own identity for a minute. If I were to ask you to write down, who are you? Or to describe to me, for example, who are you? What would you say? What would you think of? What aspects of you would come to mind? What would you mention? So this is the idea that identity is not singular, but has multiple aspects. Gender, for example, is one of them, but also sexual orientation, age, class, race, ethnicity, and that these categories are shaped by both the environment and by genetics. In other words, there's a mix of nature and nurture. Obviously, we age, for example. I mean, think of certain women that are much older in society. I've seen certain memes out there that are kind of making fun of older women in bathing suits, for example, or laughing about them in terms of sexuality, their sexual attractiveness, and that idea. So the idea that maybe an older woman might experience inequality in a different way than a woman of 20 years old. So let's take a look at Terrell Moy. This idea is that feminist is a political position. Female is a matter of biology, and feminine is a set of characteristics defined by culture. And we'll talk more about that. Let me say that one more time. Feminist is a political position. Female is a matter of biology. Feminine is a set of characteristics defined by culture. Now, second wave feminism was in part ushered in by Simone de Beauvoir's well-known text, which we'll be reading some of, called The Second Sex, which she published in 1949. The Second Sex examines the family and the labor market, childhood, sexuality, and literature, where de Beauvoir combines her feminist, psychoanalytic, and Marxist perspectives to look at the condition of women in society. And the central question is this. Now think about this. What is a woman? This is a surprisingly difficult question to answer. I mean, and you start thinking about it, there's a lot of issues around defining what a woman is. What about, we just had the Olympics recently. Think about that idea. What about defining a woman who is going to race, for example, as a runner in the Olympics? What's a woman? Does that make a difference in how that's defined? I would argue yes. Here's Simone de Beauvoir from The Second Sex. She says, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. It is civilization as a whole that produces the creature." So this is the notion that gender, how we present ourselves, how we see ourselves, how we function socially, the things we do, our habits, our hobbies, our occupations. Gender is a product of nurture, not nature. Culture, not biology. So that's what she means by one is not born but becomes a woman. Simone de Beauvoir is arguing that as such, women are made, not born. So the issue here, why is this all so difficult? Well, society is invested in this notion of two opposite, stable genders which are easily defined. Opposites are seemingly equal, but patriarchal society defines women as inferior. And if you think of binary opposites, the man is the subject. In other words, he's active. He's an active self. The woman becomes an object, the other. And you could think of a series of binaries, active and passive, rational and irrational, mind and body, order and chaos, culture and nature, strength and weakness. And when you think about these binary notions of gender, these are also apparent in early psychoanalysis. If we think about the Oedipal complex that Freud talked about and Simone de Beauvoir is talking about, it's predicated on the idea that intimacy with the female body must be relinquished or given up in order to enter into the masculine realm of social law and order. This is what Freud said and Beauvoir is discussing. So, the mother equals body. Women equal body. In other words, the realm before language, before being rational. Intimately, it's attractive, but it leads to chaos and eventually taboo. So males must separate from the female to achieve masculinity. In Freud's view, then, the father equals culture, the law, order, rationalism, and individualism. So from early on then, if you look at psychoanalysis, the boy is a subject. The boy is the possessor of the penis, which is the symbol of masculine authority in Freud's world. The girl, however, is defined by her lack. In other words, her lack of a penis means that she has what Freud called penis envy. So for Freud, a woman is not a man. In other words, defined by lack. In other words, less than, not quite a man, because of this lacking a penis. And by the way, there's a fantastic book out that you might want to check out on this kind of idea, and it's called Hung by Scott Poulsen Bryant. He's just now finishing his PhD over at Harvard and has accepted a professorship. And he was the editor of Vibe magazine. So he's very tuned into image, to how advertising and music videos and hip hop is all constructed around this sort of different kinds of masculinity. And that the penis plays a big role in it. So his book, Hung, is amazing. Strongly recommend that you check that out. So getting back to this is a broad cultural phenomenon that we're talking about. De Beauvoir identifies it in philosophy, in psychology, in politics, in religion, in society, but finds it particularly in literature. So she was really pivotal. This second sex book that she wrote, she was very pivotal in ushering in the second wave feminism. But in the 1960s and the 70s and beyond, when you think about the rising up of the gay rights movement, the rising up of the civil rights movement, suddenly this question of what is a woman becomes even more important, because feminism was playing out within its own culture wars during that period of time. And it was this question of representation. In other words, who did feminism speak for? Was there a universal meaning of the term woman? And think about it. Was there, is what they're suggesting, a universal experience amongst all women? And think through that for a minute. Is there a universal experience of all women? And if you start going down one direction, you'll say, well, all women can have children. Well, some women can't have children, right? I mean, no matter what it is you're going to think about, and think about that for a minute. What is the universal experience or the universal meaning of the term woman? You're going to end up with some problems trying to define that. So, at the time, the 60s, 70s, 80s, and beyond, many black and lesbian and Marxist feminists, and those that sort of resonated with post-colonial theories, felt that issues of race and class and nationality and sexual orientation, people talk about the diaspora, they feel that these other aspects of identity were marginalized or put out on the edges of feminism. In other words, not really baked into the notion of what feminism was all about as a political movement in favor of a normative model of femininity, which was centered upon white, middle-class, heterosexual women. And, you know, most of these women were academics, for example, or more privileged women. And so people said, well, you know, maybe their experience doesn't match the experience of other folks in different social positions. Audre Lorde is an incredible writer, by the way, and I hope you'll read her work. We're going to read some of it here. I just had a meeting recently with a gal who has an Audre Lorde poem written on her body, actually, in a tattoo that was amazing. And she writes about how the feminist movement can conceal a variety of economic, social, and racial differences. Audre Lorde, in Age, Race, Class, and Sex, Women Redefining Difference, this was from 1984, said, "There is a pretense to homogeneity of experience covered by the word sisterhood that does not, in fact, exist." So she's suggesting that there is no universal sisterhood. In other words, the commonality isn't there, that people's experiences are too different based on things like race, class, sexual orientation, for example. So this really highlights the difficulties of creating a politics based around identity when it's really hard to define what that identity is, when you need to build consensus while also opening it up to others like men who share similar goals. For example, can men be feminists? Some people would say no. By default, because they're men, they can't be feminists. But in fact, there's a whole strand of feminism that's all about men and masculinity. And again, this is all about the evolving nature of feminist theory. This isn't a static body of knowledge. This is an evolving, living movement that continues to evolve along with the changing society. So let's take a look at feminism in literature for a minute in feminist literary theory. This was very influential to a lot of feminists, and feminist theories focus on acts of reading and writing. So what you're doing in this course is very important, and a critical reading of existing works to highlight gendered politics and power relations of texts. We just looked at Simone de Beauvoir, who was talking about psychoanalysis, and Freud. And Freud has had a very powerful impact on psychology and on society and how we think about our inner lives and what they mean and how we develop as men and women. He has been a seminal author in the field of psychology and human development. So thinking about this is normal as defined by Freud. It's normal for boys to pull away from women's bodies, in other words, to become masculine men. It's normal for women to be inferior because they lack a penis. I mean, think about that. These are the ideas that were set forth in texts and that people believed and followed for years and years and years. So now there's a focus on women writers, recovering women's literature, and also explorations of gendered authorship. In other words, tracing the tradition of women's writing and examining the politics around female authorship. For feminist literary critics and Marxists as well, literature itself is a product of socio-political and historical context, but so are all readings. So that's something to think about. The text that is produced at any period of time is a product of its historical context. So think about Freud for a moment. I don't know if you've gotten a chance to read any of his theories, but he came about in the early part of the 1900s. We were just in the throes of industrialism. The steam engine had been, and the factory system had been invented. And a lot of his early physics and science was burgeoning here. And a lot of his theories took cues from physics and science and hard sciences and things like that, drives and things, to describe human behavior. So, for example, he was very influenced by that industrial era. So you want to think about that all literature and all writing is a product of its historical context. It's important to keep that in mind. So you want to look at some critiques. And one of those is Kate Millay. And in her work, Sexual Politics from 1969, she's looking at the images of women. And what she's doing is reassessing negative depictions of female characters in the works of male authors that are considered part of the canon, the must-read, and arguing that literary quality must not and cannot be considered outside of issues of political responsibility. So she's questioning which works become part of the canon, must-read books in universities, for example, and is shedding a light on the negative depictions of females and what messages that's sending out to, for example, young college students like yourself. Now, Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, I really hope you'll read this. It's a phenomenal little book, and it doesn't take long to read, but it's been so highly influential. And she is talking about the links between literature and everyday life. And she's highlighting the link between women's creativity and social and economic structures that made it difficult for women to emerge as artists. She also says that women have had a lack of role models or foremothers. You know, we talk about forefathers. Who are the role models for women? So it was a very important book. I hope you'll read it. We'll read some of it in this course, A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. Showalter, who we heard from earlier, wrote a literature of their own. And she establishes a female tradition of writing that stretches from 1800 to the mid-1970s. And she's looking at 204 women writers of the period, instead of just Jane Austen, Charlotte Bronte, Emily Bronte, George Eliot, and Virginia Woolf. Those are the big 5 women writers. She's looking at 204 women writers that have been overlooked in many ways. So she identifies 3 distinct phases of the female literary tradition. The first is the feminine phase from 1840 to 1880, where women writers imitate male literary culture and aesthetic criteria. Many women of the time published under male pseudonyms. Mary Ann Evans, for example, is the famous George Eliot. Feminist phase is 1880 to 1920, and this is a very politicized period in which women writers dramatized women's oppression under patriarchy and write literature which openly criticizes this oppression. And the third, what she calls the female phase from 1920 onward, that women turn away from imitation altogether and protest to concentrate instead on representing female experiences. And an example of that would be Virginia Woolf. So the idea being that rewriting the literary canon that has been authorized by generations of male writers and critics is central to the work of feminist literary critics and theorists, including challenging the aesthetic and conceptual criteria by which women writers and artists are judged. So this idea that we have to rewrite the script, flip the script as it were, on male writers and bring to the foreground women's writing, women's style of writing, the topics and the way women characters are presented in women's writing as a contrast to this long history of women written by men. Judith Fetterly in The Resisting Reader, 1978, said, "The first act of the feminist critic must be to become a resisting rather than an assenting reader, and by this refusal to assent, to begin the process of exercising the male mind that has been implanted in us." So this is really interesting because she's actually suggesting that this literature implants in us a male or masculine way of looking and way of ordering the world. And so she's suggesting here, and I think this is very interesting, that we want to change that by bringing out women's voices, women's experiences through women writers, a different way of thinking. Okay, so we're going to go ahead then and move on by thinking about aspects to consider when looking at what feminist literary critics really do. So they're going to rewrite the canon, which means the books that are accepted as must-reads, for example, in university classes and high school classes and things like that, by finding and reevaluating lost or ignored texts by women. Second, we want to examine conditions which lead to fewer women in the canon, which is Virginia Woolf's work in A Room of Her Own. Third, we want to examine the textual representations of women and men. How are women represented by men, by women in these texts? And we want to interrogate or question that. And that's step 4, actually, that we want to expose the presence of social gender divisions in texts. We want to highlight ways in which texts replicate or challenge gender inequalities of society. And we want to challenge problematic or stereotypical representations of women. We also want to highlight the function of text as a political tool. In other words, looking at Marx. Marx talked about base and superstructure. The base would be, for example, here in our country, in the United States, capitalism. And the superstructure ends up being the cultural manifestation which supports that base. So, in other words, you're going to have a media, you're going to have works of writing and newspapers and films that all support the predominant class, their interest in society. If you haven't read Marx, it's a very interesting critique of capitalism. So that idea that text can be a political tool to support certain people's values is important. And this idea, lastly, that we want to reappraise or look again at neutral evaluations and the idea of literary value. We want to reclaim, again, these women that were lost and set aside in lieu of men's writing, that men's writing was the best writing, and that there are some great women writers out there as well. Virginia Woolf is amazing, and there's other things she's written you might also enjoy. So I want to wrap up for today, but I just want to thank you for being here again. And again, I'm hoping these are just some preliminary ideas that we're going to be looking into in more depth over the course of our time together. And I just wanted to bring out a few historical ideas today. And we'll go on next time and drill into more detail. Next time, we'll get into a discussion about these ideas, and I'm looking forward to it. So think about them between now and our next class, and I'll see you then. Take care now. Bye-bye.